So my gardening history goes way back. My Swedish grandfather was a gardener, and when we moved to Seattle when I was in high school, one of my first jobs was working on Saturdays at Malmo Nursery in Seattle, down below the university. And I sort of fell in love with that, and at some point the University of Washington Arboretum had decided that they were going to turn over the care of the Japanese garden to the Seattle City Parks Department, but they didn't know quite when it was going to happen, and the old Japanese head gardener had retired at 85 or something, and they were advertising for the job, and I thought, well, I was sort of between lots of different things in my life. I'd love to do that job. So I worked for a couple of years doing all the pruning and weeding and taking care of the Seattle Japanese garden. So I've sort of been a gardener all my life, and when we moved to Lopez, first thing, we got a house but with no garden, and I didn't know if I was ever going to have a garden because it was all rose bushes and snowberries and brambles. So I happened to go by the library any number of times, and it struck me that the garden needed work. So I one day asked the director if it would be okay if I did some weeding and looked after the garden, just because I needed to do it because I was missing gardening. And oh, well, sure, come on. So since 2010, I've been taking care of the garden at the library. When I started with this bramble of roses and snowberries and all the other things that were growing in front of our house, I cut it all down, and then I just started with a pick and shovel, digging it all out because there was no way around it. So I dug it all out, and then I started filling it up.
As you know, Bruce has done lots of gardening over the years, and I'm definitely a support and an appreciator and a weeder. He lots of times will ask me about, should I change these plants over to here because they'll look better, they're taller or shorter, or the color's better. But I'm really just a resource person in the gardening department, and it works great for me because I do love our garden.
I have an interesting semi-deer-proof garden. I have things that they do eat, but I now have a motion detector that turns on lights at night, and usually they go away, and they've been pretty good about it this year. I was pretty nervous at first, so I planted a lot of lavender and catmint and things that I knew the deer were going to leave alone. And after the first year, I started putting in other things just to see if they would or wouldn't leave them alone, and so I learned the hard way about a lot of things. Hellebores, they seem to leave alone. Euphorbias, they leave alone. Rhubarb, they tend to leave alone most of the time. And then I've sort of gradually been trying out other things, and they seem to be leaving my columbines alone. They're leaving my delphiniums alone so far. Ornamental alliums, they seem to leave alone. It's a work in progress, I would say. So yeah, I'm having a good time gardening here, and I keep learning the things that they usually don't bother and the things that they do bother, and those things aren't in my garden anymore, courtesy of the deer. I watched my dad carving a piece of wood every time a brother or sister got born, and that's maybe where I started thinking about it. When I was 18, I went off to Alaska on a ship doing navigation chart work, and I got a piece of driftwood, and that's about the first thing I ever carved out of wood. And then over time, I just kept coming back to carving wood, and I got very interested in native West Coast art, and I did a lot of masks and bowls. I'm working on a piece of walnut right now, which is very tough, but a lot of fun when you get it finished, because it polishes up and has lots of interesting color to it. A friend was splitting shakes and he had a lot of beautiful, clear, old-growth cedar, and I said, you know, that's such a beautiful piece of wood. Could I have it? He said, oh, sure, what are you going to do with it? I said, well, I don't know. But then that's when I carved my first native-style mask, and it just sort of got to me after that, and I never stopped. Mostly, my whole family has got more pieces than they know what to do with, and our house is full of them.
We have critters all around our house outdoors, and we have a lot of wooden things on the inside, both masks and bowls.
I've met a lot of wonderful carvers like Bill Holm and Steve Brown and a lot of others, and I've taken classes here on Lopez for quite a few years back in the 90s and the early 2000s with Greg Blomberg, who makes tools, and I have a lot of his carving tools, and they're my favorite tools.
He seriously started his art career when we moved to British Columbia and had more time, and then here he's really started his stone carving.
When we moved to Lopez Island 11 years ago, my old friend from the Native Plant Society, Tamara Buchanan, who I didn't even realize was a sculptor, said, you've got to come to my house and take a class. It's in 2 weeks, and here's how you sign up. And after that camp, I got started on granite, and I just couldn't stop myself. And the first thing I carved was a little bird about this big. But then the next thing I carved was a 2-ton frog that's at the Lopez Community Center. And I just keep going. It's a lot of fun. There was a bear that I carved that's down at the Physical Therapy Center. Some granite is much harder than other granite, but this was extremely hard, and I had it roughed out, and I was ready to give up. I said, Bobby, it's just too hard, and I've got this whole section down below that I don't want to carve off. It's just, I don't think I'm going to finish it. Well, why do you want to carve it off? That bear's holding a fish. Oh, so I had inspiration, and that solved the problem. And a lot of times when I'm carving other things like black columnar basalt or green olivine, I just like to carve things that could have been that color, like a green frog or a black squirrel or an eagle or a raven, things like that. So it's more just something I'd like to carve, and the stone's the right color most of the time. This was a big nondescript granite Lopez boulder from the Ice Age. It weighed about 4 tons when I started. Once I sort of worked on it and started polishing and got it wet, it turned out to have all sorts of amazing colors and veins going through it. And this is all the same rock. So this is what it looks like unpolished, and this is what it looked like polished. I mean, and it looked way more like a wet seal than I ever imagined. So it's going to end up at the swimming pool when it gets finished, and there may be a naming contest.
Like a lot of Lopez couples who have either 1 or 2 artists, and I know a lot of them have 2, it's a little tricky sometimes, and I sometimes tell people when they say, well, what kind of art do you do? Although I dabble in a couple of different kinds, I really manage our life because it takes somebody to organize all the things around one person who is a wonderful art producer.